You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Most people think sexuality is something that we figure out early in life. We're often told that deep down, we always know who we're attracted to and that sexual identity is something that is fixed and stable. But for many people, that's not how it works. Some adults experience major shifts or realizations about their sexuality much later in life, sometimes after decades of being in heterosexual relationships or marriages. And those experiences can be confusing, exciting, terrifying, and destabilizing all at once. So why does this happen? Can sexuality really change over time? And what does it mean when you suddenly begin questioning parts of yourself that you thought were already settled? Today, we're exploring the psychology of coming out later in life and the process of discovering new aspects of your sexuality that you may not have consciously understood before. We'll discuss the hidden forces that shape sexuality, why psychological flexibility matters, and how people can navigate these experiences with greater compassion and less shame. My guest is Jess Levith, a licensed marriage and family therapist and certified sex therapist. She's fully trained in both attachment-focused EMDR therapy and trauma-focused acceptance and commitment therapy. She works with LGBTQIA and kinky folks, consensual non-monogamy, women's sexual health, and problematic and out-of-control sexual behavior. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around, and we're going to jump in right after the break. Ever wondered how sex differs around the world? Come study it with me. Join me and Sexual Health Alliance for an immersive study abroad experience where we explore sexuality, psychology, culture, and science firsthand. You'll learn from international experts, travel to incredible places, and connect with students from around the globe. Since 2015, Sexual Health Alliance has been at the forefront of sexuality education, and you can be part of it. Join me, Shaw, and a global community of students for a transformative study abroad adventure. Later this year, we're heading to Berlin and Copenhagen, both of which are beautiful cities to experience and full of incredible learning opportunities. Spots are limited, so head to sexualhealthalliance.com to learn more and reserve yours. Come explore the world and the science of sex with me. If you're looking to gain a broad understanding of human sexuality or refresh your knowledge, check out the next Human Sexuality Intensive at the Kinsey Institute. Participants will explore foundational concepts and recent developments across a range of topics related to human sexuality through an interdisciplinary, evidence-based lens. Topics will include sex, gender and sexuality, identity and intersectionality, sexual behavior and consent, dating and relationships, and more. This course is open to both emerging and established professionals looking to specialize their knowledge, as well as those seeking new career directions. Previous participants have come from all over the world, and those who successfully complete the program will receive a course certificate from the Kinsey Institute. The next intensives will be in May and June of this year. To learn more, visit kinseyinstitute.org or check the link in the show notes. Hi, Jess, and welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you as well, and it's a pleasure to have you here. So I feel like I've seen a ton of media articles and scientific studies recently about adults coming out later in life. Many people feel as though their sexuality has suddenly shifted or they're starting to question it, sometimes after decades of being in heterosexual relationships or marriages. You've said that you personally had an experience along these lines that genuinely surprised you. So I was wondering if we could start there. What can you tell us about that and what happened for you?
Yes, that was quite the evening. I was at a sex therapy training, my first one, and I realized in that moment that I actually found the woman of the partners that were there attractive, and it just completely floored me. I had no idea. I had never been attracted to women before. I didn't have women friends. It was completely shocking.
Yeah. And, you're not alone in having that experience. Like I said, I've read a lot of articles recently about this phenomenon of later in life sexuality shifting or changing. And sometimes it is that very sudden thing where it just kind of hits you out of the blue. And I think what's really interesting about this is that a lot of people assume that sexuality is something that we fully discover early in life, but clearly that's often not the case. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why people don't necessarily fully recognize or consciously understand certain aspects of their sexuality until much later in adulthood.
seeing all of these celebrities and articles about people coming out later is pretty validating. And I'm hoping it feels that way for other people as well. There are so many reasons why we may not know, as is the answer with everything in sexual health. Part of it is our context. In my particular context, I'm married. I was married with a kid, baby at the time. He's now older. And realizing this part of my sexuality after I deconstructed what had happened, I realized that my particular life circumstances paper-mached over this part of my sexuality. The combination of traumas and avoidance, it all buried it so deeply that I had absolutely no clue. And I had people suggesting it to me throughout my life. And I was like, what are you talking about? That's wild. But what I'm saying is that when I got into this relationship with my husband, I finally felt safe, like fully safe. My body finally felt safe and regulated. And I believe that what happened was it allowed for the eroticism to rise up. Mm-hmm. And that is in my mind, what I see is happening for a lot of people is they get to a certain place in their life, or their kids have gone off to college, or, their kids have gotten old enough to where they aren't the primary focus of the marriage anymore, or the partnership anymore. And we start looking at ourselves and things start happening and shifting. And our sexuality is absolutely fluid. And it changes throughout our entire lives.
Mm-hmm. And, I think midlife is a particularly interesting point for our sexuality. And it's where a lot of these shifts happen. And, I see this in my research on sexual fantasies, that people at different decades of life tend to fantasize about different things. And actually during midlife is when our fantasies actually become much more exploratory in a lot of ways. And I think that's because there are lots of things that are happening at midlife. Sometimes it's people who have been in very long-term monogamous relationships where there's this yearning or desire to try something new and different. Sometimes it's because you're divorced and you're out exploring your sexuality on your own terms for maybe the first time in your life. There's also often this increase in sexual confidence that happens when people approach midlife. And that also opens the door to sort of exploring your sexuality in different ways. And then people also, give fewer fucks at midlife about what other people think about them, right? And so that also creates an opportunity to kind of explore aspects of the self that maybe you didn't previously feel comfortable exploring. Is there anything you want to add about just sort of like midlife as an interesting point in time for sexual exploration?
Yes, I think that people who happen to be in midlife around this time, like in this day and age, right? We grew up in this interesting space of parents were of the 60s and 70s, mm-hmm. and we had a little more access and a little more progress towards exploration, but we didn't have the education mm-hmm. at all. And so what I'm finding is a lot of people that I talk with that are my age don't have any idea about sexual health and what exploration actually looks like or could look like for them. And now they're coming to this point where they're giving less fucks and they are saying, well, I've only got this one life. How about we just live it to its fullest and see what we can find?
Yeah. And related to that, I think a lot of us, when we were younger, for people who are at this midlife stage, a lot of the terminology around sexuality and gender that we have today didn't exist back then. And we had very binary ways of thinking growing up in terms of how we approach things like gender and sexuality. And so we kind of felt more pressure to kind of fit neatly into one box or the other. And now that we see and think about things through a more expansive lens, it creates more opportunities. And it doesn't necessarily mean that in all of these cases that who you are is fundamentally changing, but maybe it opens up the door to seeing yourself in a different light and understanding and recognizing that there are different ways of being and that things maybe aren't quite as binary as we thought before.
It is such a beautiful thing. It's really starting to open up. So I use acceptance and commitment therapy. And mm-hmm. the primary piece of that is psychological flexibility, and I take that into the sexual health work, like how fused to this belief of who you think you are sexually. And what is that serving? And when I find people in the biggest struggles is when they are trying to have an absolute truth of something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I totally agree.
So, I think a lot of people would intuitively assume that if someone comes out later in life, that it must mean that they were repressing their sexuality the whole time because of shame or social pressure. And while that might absolutely be true for some people, that's not always what we're talking about here, right?
Nope. I mean, I think in my particular case, it might have been an element of it for sure. But I think I've seen so many people come into my room who are just shifting around different biological pieces are shifting, hormonal changes for all genders.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got the context shifts. And our sexuality is a development that comes up through our life, our entire life. So as our context changes, our sexuality is inherently going to change, just like every other part of us.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about this sexual context, or I think you also refer to it as our sexy gumbo, right? So what are some of the specific life experiences or environmental factors that might be subtly shaping our sexuality over time in ways that people might not fully realize or appreciate?
Well, I primarily work with women. So I would say oftentimes people who have birthed a human, that changes your sexuality. I think everything from hair changing color to how we're feeling in our body, our aches and our pains, and do we now have certain body dysmorphia, and how does that impact it? Are we partnered? Are we happily partnered? All of these things change someone's desire to have sex, to not have sex, to have increased, decreased. And then there are people who have always been more curious around kink or non-monogamy. And they've gotten to this point where they're just like, I don't want to go through this life and not have tried this.
Yeah. So there can be a, sort of bucket list element to this in a way, in the sense that, at midlife, people also often start realizing that your time is limited. And if there are things that you want to try and do, like, now's the time, because you might not necessarily have those opportunities later on, because we never know how our health or our lives are going to change in the future. So lots and lots of things going on here that could potentially explain this. And, this conversation has me thinking about a couple of recent discussions I've had with midlife gay men who have talked about just being attracted to very different types of people now than they were when they were younger. And in fact, one of them was just saying to me the other day how, when he was younger, in his 20s or so, people that are his age now, he would never be into, would never find them attractive. And now he's like, now I'm that person who was unattractive to younger me, but I find that I'm actually very attracted to people who are like me now, right? And so instead of being attracted to, sort of younger guys, he's now into daddies. And, it's a very different, erotic shift for him. And part of that might be related to the natural aging process, but there's also just this overall shift in our erotic context and our social and cultural context as well, which also defines in some ways what is considered to be desirable. And, we're kind of in this daddy era where daddies are very much eroticized. And I think that also for many men who are at midlife is also kind of freeing and liberating to them in a way that there's not as much of this emphasis on youth as being the end all be all in terms of what defines attractiveness.
Yeah, it was interesting. I had someone make a comment on something I had posted because I was talking about aging and sexuality, and they were like, 36 is aging. And I was like, you betcha, Going back to the differences in what one might find attractive is, yes, as we age, as we shift in our value system, as we shift in really what matters to us. And if sexual health matters to us and sexual excitement and desire and drive matter to us, and we're seeking out so much more education that's available, right? We're just going to keep getting curious. And getting curious does not mean you are XYZ. Getting curious means opening your mind to some kind of flexibility of trying it on in your mind.
Yeah, and that's where fantasy, often comes into play because fantasy is a playground where we can kind of explore some of our curiosities and see whether it might be something that we might like to actually do or try in real life. Now, of course, fantasy doesn't always match up with reality. And sometimes the things we fantasize about when we try them in real life, we're like, oh, nope, that's not for me. But, that's just sort of the nature of things is that sometimes we don't really know what we're into until we actually try it ourselves in real life.
That causes so much distress in
Yeah.
the clients that I see, is this idea of, oh my God, I had the thought. Does that mean, XYZ about me personally? And the truth is, some of these things that we fantasize about, when we actually turn towards them and take a look at them, they kind of evaporate, and it's all the fantasy of it that was bringing that charge.
This also reminds me of what I was talking about at Esther Perel's Sessions Live event a couple of weeks ago. I was talking about what our fantasies really mean and what they symbolize or represent in our lives. And sometimes they're reflective of some deeper unmet need or yearning that we have. And, when we just look at the fantasy at the surface level, the fantasy we have might not really be driven by that particular activity that's taking place in it. And it might just be more about some deeper underlying need that's simply being expressed through that particular activity. And so I think our fantasies are often meaningful and symbolic in that way. But in your work, you use the term sexual emergence to describe these new realizations about sexuality. So I wondered if you could talk about what that term means to you and maybe how it's different from our traditional idea of quote unquote coming out.
Yeah. So sexual emergence, when this all happened, went down, my brain just kind of exploded and I had no idea, no framework to hold what was happening. And the only thing I had heard ever of coming out was this idea of, sitting people down and saying, this is me, I'm bisexual, right? But when I went back through the literature and was looking at the different milestones, what I realized was on the front end, there's this moment where you are having a shift of going from a state of not knowing to a state of suddenly knowing. And in that moment, that is the beginning of the emergence. And then the emergence from there, it just kind of expands and develops as you go through it. So I don't think it's one exact moment. I think it's actually a process. Mm-hmm. But I think it's different than coming out, because coming out is kind of naming it publicly. This is what's happening. But I had no idea what was happening for years, so that whole process of trying to figure it out in the identity formation and that's the emergence.
Yeah, I like that way of thinking about it, that it's a process and that process might not look the same for everyone. And it might not always be linear in terms of how it plays out. And somebody who experiences this sexual emergence may or may not come out later because it kind of depends on their own individual journey. So again, everybody's story always looks a little bit different. But I think many people fear that if their sexuality changes later in life, that it somehow means that their previous relationships or identities weren't real, right? They start questioning their entire past. So I wondered if you could help us think about this maybe in a healthier way.
Yeah, and that makes me really sad to hear, but it's very, very true. I was asking myself that constantly. Mm-hmm. Is everything that I lived up until this point not real, not true? And the truth is that it is. What happened to me in the context of those moments really happened. I really had those experiences. Going back to this idea of, did you feel it? Did you go through that experience with that particular person in that context? That was the only context available to you at the time. If you did, then it was real. Mm-hmm. What do you feel inside your body as real? Can you hold that it was real? And now you have more information about that reality.
So for people who are in long-term relationships who are experiencing this sexual emergence, those realizations can feel terrifying, right? Because they're something that you never expected to feel or never anticipated. And not just for the person who's experiencing them, but also for their partner. So I wondered if you could speak to, how do you navigate relationships in this way when you experience sexual emergence and maybe you've spent many years or decades with that partner? Like, how do you bring that up or talk to your partner about that?
That was by far the hardest and scariest part because I didn't know what was happening to me myself, right? And so I didn't know if what I was telling my partner was accurate. I didn't know anything. So I knew enough to get into therapy. I knew enough to go see a sex therapist myself first to get a grounding. I did tell my partner very, very early on, probably even that night, because my partner and I are constantly, we're the talky type. But I knew for me, in order to stay buoyed in some way to what matters to me, which is being honest, I had to say something. So I initially said something like, I don't know what this is going to look like. It's terrifying for me to say this to you because I love you and I don't want this to change. And this is happening. Something's happening. And my partner, he's a rock star. He was like, all right, let's see what's going to happen. My partner and I have just been open and honest about it ever since.
And I love that. I love that you had a supportive partner there. Unfortunately, that's not the reality for everyone. And, navigating these conversations is going to be difficult and people's paths might look very different here. Some partners might feel, very shaken by the idea that, well, now I'm with somebody who has these different sexual attractions and they might start questioning themselves and the relationship that they have with you. And so I think that could be a case where working with a therapist would be very valuable in terms of approaching this from the standpoint of couples therapy.
Absolutely. I think what's really, really important and something that I tried to be mindful of from the beginning was how would this sound coming from me on the other end? Like if I were my partner and they came to me with a completely different piece of their identity, I would be floored too. And so really having that compassion and space for your partner to completely flip out and understand that and you were honest and you're not trying to split off and pretend this doesn't exist.
So I imagine that one of the hardest parts of late in life sexual exploration is the uncertainty. People often want clarity immediately. For example, what label am I? What does this mean? What should I do? But you might not figure everything out right away. So what advice would you give to someone who's feeling anxious about suddenly not knowing who they are sexually?
I'm just thinking about all the things that you don't do that I did. I would say seek out community. Find community. No matter how you now identify, there is a group. Go slowly. You're going to have this urge to just figure it all out. And as fast as you go, you can't make time go that fast. Things just have to play out and seek out education that is positive, sex positive. That can be really hard for some people to find an outlet that is supportive.
Yeah, and I think that's all great advice. And I think a lot of it aligns with what we would tell people who are kind of struggling with any aspect of fantasy or sexuality that they're kind of feeling some shame or uncertainty about. Oftentimes it's because they feel alone in it, like they're the only one who has that experience. And so finding community and understanding that, no, you're not alone. Lots of other people are experiencing the same thing. That in and of itself can just feel very validating and can help to remove a lot of the shame and the anxiety. And yes, also seeking out those sex positive resources that can kind of give you the education and terminology and different ways of trying to understand that and contextualize it in your own life. And yes, I also love the advice about going slow. There's going to be the temptation to want to rush this, but sexual exploration usually works best when it's a gradual, slow process of curiosity and self-discovery.
Yeah, you can always speed up, but it's much tougher to slow back down.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, why do you think we're hearing so many more stories now about people coming out later in life or questioning their sexuality at these later ages? Is this phenomenon actually becoming more common, or do people maybe just feel safer talking about it? Like, so in other words, is this something that's kind of always been around, or is it something that is on the rise?
I would say it's probably more about being a space where we can bring it up.
Yeah.
My first thought was because parents are looking at their kids and getting jealous. There's so much more space to be on any kind of spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think that the generation, I'm talking about Generation X in particular, tends to be more exploratory and now has access to resources that they didn't have access to.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really fun combination.
Yeah. And, I guess my sense of it would be, I do think it's becoming more common because in previous generations, when they were at this age, they felt very constrained in terms of their choices and what their life was, quote unquote, supposed to be. And many people just didn't feel empowered enough to try and make a change, or didn't really have the language or tools or resources for navigating that. Or maybe there was just too much fear and uncertainty around kind of tapping into that. And so they kind of repressed it. I think it was a lot harder for people in previous generations to explore their sexuality later in life because there was so much more judgment and social constraint on our relationships and what they were expected to be.
Oh, yeah. So I totally agree with what you're saying. I thought that you meant, is it in the body more now? It's not occurring in people more. I think it's being out more. That is definitely growing.
Yeah. So I have one more question for you. And this is it's a doozy, but I think it's an important question in this context, right? And it's about how we start helping people think differently about sexuality and moving away from this idea that sexuality is this fixed thing early in life, but doing that in a way where we're also mindful of the political implications, right? Because a lot of the LGBT rights advocacy has historically leaned on this idea that people are, quote unquote, born this way. But if sexuality is more fluid and developmental than we previously thought, how do we talk about that responsibly without giving ammunition to the conversion therapy narratives, right? Because a lot of people hear this idea that sexuality is fluid and they immediately go to, oh, well, we can change people's sexuality. And so conversion therapy should be a thing, right? So just curious if you have any thoughts on this.
That is such a hard question. What comes to my mind is it's a very full picture. Someone's sexuality isn't about biology or environment. It is about everything.
Yeah.
And there are some pieces to our biology that are there in place. There is a template, and then I kind of see it as like a template that we then get to paint with. And so, no, you're not going to be able to convert someone from being gay to straight. There's so much research around this, and so much pain that people have to go through. You have these certain elements and flavors when you're born. And then as you grow up, just like how you dress, just like what music you like, you are impacted by the world around you. And that shapes who you think you are and how other people see you sexually.
And I think, in terms of the way that we think about this, for some people, their sexuality is very fixed and very stable throughout their lives. But for other people, it's much more context dependent, and there will be shifts and changes and experiences with fluidity. And so I think we need to broaden our way of thinking about sexuality to understand that it can look very different in different people in terms of its degree of being fixed versus how flexible and fluid it is. And one of these things does not necessarily have to undermine the other because they're all valid forms of sexuality. And I think, the real key point that you bring up is that, no, you can't intentionally change your sexuality, right? We've been talking about this process of sexual emergence where it just happens over time in response to your shifting erotic and sexual context. That's not the same as saying, okay, I don't want to be this sexuality anymore and I want to be this one. That kind of thing doesn't work, right? This is just more of a spontaneous, naturally evolving process as opposed to evidence that you can intentionally change your sexuality.
Yes, that has always baffled me, because then I ask the question, do you think that people choose to be a sexuality that has been condemned for millennia? It goes both ways. You cannot change it.
And we have to learn to accept that, hey, maybe it's not always going to be this way in terms of my sexuality, and that fluidity might happen, and it might happen suddenly and spontaneously. And we need to be aware of that so that we can be prepared if and when it does happen to us or it happens to a partner, right? And it's a complex, challenging dynamic to navigate, but I'm glad we have people like you who are talking about it and helping provide people with the tools and resources they need to navigate those experiences. So thank you so much for your time, Jess. I really appreciate having you here. And I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation in the next episode and talking all about out of control sexual behavior. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Definitely. So you can check out my work at sexual-context.com or jesslevith.com. I will be at the Sexual Health Alliance Sexceptional Conference in a couple of weeks doing this training with Michael Vigorito on ACT and cisgender women, OCSB. It's going to be awesome.
Great. Well, I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.